A child vanished into a blizzard after following the desperate cry of a wounded dog. The snow was falling sideways, erasing every trace, turning minutes into the difference between life and death. No search teams could reach them. No signal could guide them. Deep in the Montana wilderness, a retired Navy SEAL tried to convince himself it wasn't his problem anymore, until his German Shepherd reacted with a warning so fierce it felt like fate breaking through the storm. What lay buried in the snow would drag him back into a fight he believed he had escaped for good. If stories of survival, loyalty, and refusing to walk away matter to you, like this video, subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Ethan Cole lived at the very edge of things, where plowed roads surrendered to packed snow, where cell signals thinned into silence, where the forest no longer cared whether a man existed or not. His cabin sat just inside the boundary of Montana's national forest, an old structure of darkened timber and reinforced beams, built decades earlier for rangers who no longer came this far out in winter. The roof carried the weight of snow without complaint. The windows were narrow and set deep, designed to hold heat and keep eyes out. It was not a place meant for visitors, and that suited Ethan just fine. He was 40 years old, tall, just over 6 feet, his posture still instinctively straight, despite years spent trying to unlearn it. His body carried the quiet mass of functional strength, broad shoulders, a thick back, a chest built more for endurance than display. His skin was weathered and sun-darkened, textured by cold winds and high-altitude glare rather than age. His hair was cut short in a tactical military style, the sides clipped tight, the top kept just long enough to stand without effort. Brown at its core, it had begun to silver early at the temples, a subtle reminder of time passing that he neither fought nor acknowledged. A short, disciplined stubble framed his jaw, trimmed regularly, not for vanity, but because disorder made his skin crawl. Ethan had once been a Navy SEAL. He did not say former or retired. He simply no longer was. Titles like that belonged to the world he had stepped out of, the world of briefings and objectives, and men whose names were etched into metal plaques somewhere far away. Here, there were no ranks, no call signs, no radios crackling with urgency, only snow, trees, and the long, deliberate quiet of survival. His days followed a strict, almost ritualistic order. He rose before dawn, not because he needed to, but because his body refused to sleep past it. He checked snow traps along the perimeter of the trail he maintained, repaired fallen markers, cleared wind-drifted paths that no one but him would walk. He ate simple meals, high in calories, low in ceremony. By evening, he cleaned his tools, stacked firewood, and went to bed early. There was no television, no radio, no news of a world he had chosen not to participate in. Human voices were rare enough that when he heard them, they felt intrusive, almost unnatural. The only living presence that shared his routine was Rex. Rex was not a pet. He had never been one. At 6 or 7 years old, the German Shepherd was large, powerfully built, and balanced in the way only working dogs were. His frame was long and athletic, his back straight and strong, his chest deep, his hindquarters coiled with quiet strength. His coat was dense and close, black dominating his back and shoulders, fading into warm tan along his legs, chest, and face. His ears stood erect even at rest, sharp triangles tuned perpetually toward the world. His eyes, dark, intelligent, and steady, missed nothing. Rex had once worn a harness marked with unit insignia. He no longer did. Now he wore only a simple dark collar, scuffed with age, unadorned. He slept near the door, his body angled outward, as if guarding against an approach that never came. He rose at the same hours every day, circled the cabin perimeter with measured precision, and paused at specific points that no longer served a tactical purpose, but remained engraved in his memory. the war had ended for Rex as little as it had for Ethan. Late one afternoon, the light already thinning under the weight of gathering clouds, Ethan returned from the trail to find his phone vibrating on the small wooden table near the window. He rarely carried it and almost never checked it. The number on the screen was unfamiliar at first glance. Then, recognition struck, quiet and unwelcome. Claire Monroe. The name carried weight he had never fully set down. Claire had been a veterinarian by training, a wildlife rescue volunteer by choice. She was tall and lean, with a runner's build and a presence that filled rooms without demanding attention. Her hair, dark blonde, usually pulled back in a practical knot, had always escaped restraint when she worked, loose strands framing a face marked more by empathy than softness. Her skin bore freckles from years outdoors. Her hands were strong, steady, and capable. She had loved fiercely and without conditions. That, in the end, had been the problem. Ethan read the message once. Ethan, if you still have this number, we're heading up the mountain. The storm's coming faster than forecast. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, his thumb hovering above the glass. The past stirred, not as images, but as pressure. The memory of arguments, spoken in low voices late at night. Of silence, stretched too thin. Of a moment, years earlier, when Claire had needed him fully present, and he had been somewhere else entirely, trapped in a war that refused to stay buried. He locked the phone and set it face down on the table. The decision was already forming, familiar in its shape. He would do nothing. People chose their paths. Storms came and went. He had no obligation left to anyone beyond the thin ring of land he maintained and the dog at his side. He turned away. That was when Rex moved. The dog rose from his resting place near the door, not abruptly, but with a deliberate tension that immediately drew Ethan's attention. Rex crossed the room and stopped at the old metal hook mounted near the wall, the one that still held a length of frayed climbing rope from another life. He lifted a paw and scratched at it, once, twice, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. Then he stepped back and blocked the doorway with his body, standing square and unmoving. Ethan frowned. Rex. The dog did not respond in the way pets did. There was no wagging tail, no eager compliance. Instead, Rex lowered his head slightly and released a low, resonant growl, not aggressive, not defensive, but urgent. A warning sound Ethan had learned to trust more than any sensor or satellite feed. Easy, Ethan said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Rex's eyes never left him. The air in the cabin felt different suddenly, charged in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Ethan felt it in his chest, the tightening he had spent years suppressing. He looked back at the table, at the phone resting there, like an accusation. Then Rex did something he had not done in years. He sat, perfect posture, eyes locked, waiting. That, more than anything else, broke through Ethan's resistance. That was not a habit Rex retained from cabin life. That was operational behavior. A signal, a readiness that belonged to another time, another world. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, exhaled through his nose, and felt the weight of a decision settle into place. Not obligation, not heroism, just refusal to lie to himself one more time. He pulled on his jacket, thick and weathered, its seams reinforced for cold that cut to bone. He retrieved the hunting rifle from its rack, not the weapons of his past, but a tool suited to this land. Rex moved instantly, alert and focused, his earlier tension resolving into purpose. Ethan paused at the door, one hand on the latch, listening to the wind begin to rise outside. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered, to Rex or to himself. Rex did not respond. He simply stood ready. Ethan opened the door and stepped into the cold, not because it was his duty, but because, this time, He could not pretend he hadn't heard the call. The storm arrived without ceremony, as storms in the mountains often did. There was no dramatic wall of clouds rolling in, no distant thunder to warn those who still believed warnings mattered. One moment, the world was muted gray and cold. The next, it was erased. Snow fell not downward but sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to have intent, cutting visibility down to a few body lengths and swallowing sound until even Rex's movements became shapes rather than forms. The temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that did not sting at first, but pressed inward, heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself were trying to slow the blood. Ethan felt it immediately. The shift. Years of training told him the conditions had crossed a line. GPS was useless now. The signal blinked out and never returned. The compass needle on his wrist-mounted backup spun lazily, confused by mineral-rich rock beneath the snow and the electromagnetic chaos of the storm. Direction, in the way most men understood it, no longer existed. There was only terrain and judgment. He moved carefully, placing each step with deliberation, following a route he had walked dozens of times during calmer winters. This was the safe line, the one that avoided steep drop-offs and wind-loaded slopes. He trusted it because it was predictable, and predictability had once kept him alive. Rex, however, did not share that trust. The dog surged forward, then veered sharply left, tugging the leash hard enough to pull Ethan off balance. Snow sprayed up as Ethan dug in his boots, planting his weight. "Rex," he said, his voice steady but firm. The command should have been enough. Rex knew it. He slowed but did not return to the line. Instead, he angled his body again, muscles taut beneath his thick coat, head lifted high into the wind, as if tasting something Ethan could not perceive. His ears flicked, not back and forth, but forward, locked. Ethan's jaw tightened. Heel. Rex glanced back at him, eyes dark and intent, then looked away again. He did not disobey in the way untrained dogs did. He did not panic or pull wildly. He simply refused to comply. Ethan stood there longer than was comfortable, the wind clawing at his jacket, snow creeping down his collar. This was the moment where logic demanded authority, where training insisted on command hierarchy. But this was not a patrol with human lives stacked behind a decision tree. It was just him and a dog and a mountain that did not care which of them was right. Finally, Ethan loosened his grip on the leash. "All right," he muttered. "Show me." Rex moved instantly, bounding forward with renewed purpose, cutting across terrain Ethan would have avoided. They descended into a shallow ravine where snow had drifted unevenly, the surface broken by subtle depressions and raised ridges. Ethan's eyes scanned automatically, cataloging anomalies, and that was when he saw it. Metal. The dark, angular line of a vehicle's undercarriage jutted from a bank of snow at an unnatural angle. Ethan slowed, heart rate climbing not from exertion, but recognition. He approached carefully, circling wide, his breath visible in short, controlled bursts. It was a rescue vehicle, white, with faded county markings barely visible beneath ice and frost. It had not simply slid off the trail. It had rolled, hard, coming to rest against a cluster of half-buried boulders. Rex lowered his head, sniffing along the snow-packed ground. Ethan followed the line of the dog's nose and saw what Rex had already confirmed. The tracks were wrong. Not a single clean path of movement, but staggered drag marks, uneven and interrupted. Someone had been moved. And then there was the blood. There was not much of it. Thin streaks, diluted, partially absorbed into the snow. Ethan crouched, gloved fingers hovering just above the surface without touching. Hypothermia. He murmured to no one. Blood that thin meant circulation had slowed before it was spilled. Whoever this was had been cold for a long time. Cold, but not dead. Rex did not linger. He moved on, pulling Ethan forward again, past the wreck, toward a narrower cut in the land where the wind screamed louder, funneled between stone and ice. Ethan followed, pulse hammering now, not from fear, but from the dawning certainty that the situation was worse and more precise than he had expected. They found her beneath the overhang of a rock shelf, half buried in snow that had drifted just enough to insulate without suffocating. Claire Monroe lay on her side, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, one leg pinned beneath her. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, lashes frosted with ice. Her breathing was shallow but present, each rise of her chest a small, stubborn defiance. Ethan was beside her in seconds, movements automatic. He knelt, shielded her from the wind with his body, and checked her pulse. Weak, thready, alive. "Claire," he said, louder this time. "Claire, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered, unfocused at first, then sharpened slightly as she registered sound. Pain flickered across her face, quickly swallowed by exhaustion. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones more pronounced, lines etched at the corners of her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow. Her dark blonde hair had escaped its tie, plastered to her face with melted frost. Even now, even broken and freezing, she looked more real than any memory he had carried. "Ethan," she breathed, disbelief woven into the syllables. He swallowed, forced himself to stay clinical. "You're hurt, legs pinned. We'll get you out." Her hand twitched weakly against the snow, fingers curling as if searching for something. Her gaze slid past him, unfocused again, and then snapped back with sudden clarity. Fear surged through her expression, sharper than the pain. "Lucas," she whispered. Ethan paused. "What?" Her voice cracked, the words scraping out of her throat with effort. "Lucas, he's not here." The wind roared louder in that instant, as if the mountain itself were reacting. Ethan felt the words settle into his chest like ice water. He scanned the area instinctively, searching for movement, color, any sign of another body. There was nothing, just snow and stone and the screaming white void beyond. "Where's Lucas?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Claire shook her head weakly, tears freezing at the corners of her eyes. He went after the dog. I told him not to. I tried to follow. Then the trail..." Her voice failed, her body shuddering violently as the last of her strength bled away. Rex, who had been circling the perimeter, froze. His head snapped up, ears rigid, eyes locked on a point downwind. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stood, body tense, tail low but steady. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and felt a slow, creeping unease. There, barely visible beneath the blowing snow, were tracks, smaller than adult footprints, erratic but deliberate. And beside them, another set, lighter, uneven. Not human. Rex let out a low sound then, not a warning, but something closer to recognition. Ethan looked back at Claire, unconscious now, her breath fogging weakly in the air. He knew what the next minutes demanded of him. He also knew what the next hours might cost. He reached for his radio out of reflex, then stopped himself. There was no signal, no cavalry, just decisions. Rex turned back toward him, eyes steady, waiting. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than the storm itself. "All right," he said quietly, to the dog and the mountain, and whatever else might be listening. One thing at a time. He began preparing to move Claire, even as his mind raced ahead, already tracing the path of tracks that led deeper into the storm, away from anything that resembled safety. The cabin was warm in the way only old wood and steady fire could manage. Heat did not rush to meet you. It waited, gathered slowly, settled into bones that had learned to distrust comfort. Ethan laid Claire on the narrow cot near the stove, moving with controlled care, supporting her leg and easing her down without jarring the brake. Snow melted from her clothes in dark patches on the floor, the smell of wet wool and cold iron filling the room. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls, relentless. But the cabin held. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness as Ethan worked. He cut away fabric where he needed to, splinted her leg as best he could with practiced efficiency, wrapped her in layers of blankets pulled from a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Their hands brushed once, brief, accidental, and neither of them acknowledged it. There was no relief in their reunion, no instinctive closeness, only the weight of unfinished conversations stacked carefully between them like something fragile and dangerous. When Claire finally stirred again, her eyes opened with effort, focusing slowly as if the room were underwater. She took in the cabin, the rough-hewn beams, the stove, the absence of clutter. Then Ethan standing nearby, arms folded loosely across his chest. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. Ethan did not pretend to misunderstand. "You're hurt." "That's not what I meant." He let the silence stretch, the fire popping softly in the background. Rex lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert, his body positioned so he could see both the entrance and the room beyond. Even at rest, he was working. Claire swallowed, her throat dry. Lucas left before the worst of it. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had already known this was coming, but knowing did not blunt the impact. Why? She closed her eyes, a pained expression crossing her face that had nothing to do with her injury. Because he heard something. Ethan exhaled slowly. "A storm will make you hear things." "I know," she said. "I told him that." Her voice wavered then, just slightly, and she opened her eyes again, fixing them on the ceiling as if the truth were easier to say when she didn't have to look at him. "But he said it sounded like a dog. Hurt. Crying." Ethan shook his head, a sharp, frustrated motion. "He's 12. And he's been carrying something he doesn't know how to put down." She turned her head toward him then, really looking at him for the first time since he'd brought her inside. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear, too clear for someone who had nearly frozen to death. "His father," she said, "died in a mine collapse years ago." Ethan said nothing. "There was another man trapped with him," Claire continued. "Lucas knows the story because it never stopped being told. His father heard the man calling. He didn't go back. The roof was unstable. Everyone said it was the right call." Her voice broke on the last word. "But Lucas doesn't hear it that way," she said. "He hears that his father walked away." The cabin felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had inched closer. "He told me once," she went on, "that if he ever heard someone, or something, calling for help and didn't go, he'd become the kind of man he was afraid his father had been." Ethan looked down at his hands, scarred and steady, hands that had made decisions with consequences measured in lives. He understood that kind of fear, the fear of what inaction might turn you into. Rex lifted his head then, ears twitching. He rose and padded across the room, nose low to the floor, tracing a path that led from the door to the far corner of the cabin, where Ethan had dropped his pack. He paused, sniffed, then turned sharply back toward the door, body stiffening. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Rex did not respond to the question. He went to the door and sat, posture rigid, tail still, gaze fixed on the seam where cold air crept in. Claire watched the dog, her brow furrowing. "He does that when he's thinking, doesn't he?" Ethan nodded once. "When something doesn't fit?" He pulled on his outer layer again, the fabric stiff with frost, and opened the door just enough to let Rex move past him. The dog stepped into the storm without hesitation, head lifting into the wind, nostrils flaring. Snow dusted his coat, clinging to the dark fur along his back. Rex moved a short distance from the cabin and stopped, sniffing at the ground where fresh snow had partially covered older tracks. Ethan crouched beside him, brushing away the loose powder with a gloved hand. The marks beneath were faint but unmistakable, small boots, child-sized, and beside them, lighter, uneven impressions, paw prints, elongated and narrow, not the rounded depth of a wolf's track. Not a wolf, Ethan muttered. Rex followed the line of prints forward, then paused abruptly, letting out a soft, unfamiliar sound. Not a growl, not a bark. Something lower, almost questioning. Ethan felt it then, a quiet shift in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when Rex scratched at the old rope in the cabin. This wasn't panic. This wasn't prey drive. This was recognition. They followed the tracks into a shallow dip where the wind had scoured the snow thinner. The paw prints grew more erratic there, staggering slightly. Ethan could see where the animal had favored one leg, dragging it faintly through the snow. Whatever Lucas had followed, it was injured. "Damn it," Ethan said under his breath. They moved carefully, Rex leading, but checking back frequently now, slowing his pace to keep Ethan close. The trail bent away from the main path, angling toward rockier ground, where the snow lay in broken sheets over stone. It was dangerous terrain for a child, even without the storm. Halfway along the trail, Rex stopped again. Ethan nearly collided with him, then followed the dog's gaze. There, pressed into the snow beside a cluster of scrub pine, was a small glove. Blue, cheap fabric, the kind sold in bulk for winter programs. One finger was torn open, stuffing exposed. Ethan picked it up, turning it over slowly. The inside was damp, stiffening as the cold reclaimed it. "He didn't drop this running," Ethan said quietly. He stopped. Claire's words echoed in his mind. If he ever heard someone calling. Rex nosed the glove gently, then moved on, following the trail where it narrowed again, human and animal tracks converging until they nearly overlapped. That was when Ethan saw the second set clearly. The dog's prints were larger now, more defined. German Shepherd, but the spacing was wrong. Shorter stride, uneven pressure. The animal was favoring its right hind leg. Rex let out another low sound, something like a breath held too long and finally released. His tail lowered slightly, not in submission, but in focus. "He's not lost," Ethan said aloud, the realization settling into him with a strange mix of dread and understanding. He made a choice. Rex looked back at him then, eyes steady, as if confirming what Ethan had already accepted. Lucas had not wandered into the storm blindly. He had followed something weaker than himself, something that could not make the choice to turn back. Ethan straightened, snow swirling around his boots, the weight of the situation pressing down hard now. Somewhere ahead, a 12-year-old boy and a wounded dog were moving deeper into terrain that did not forgive mistakes. And behind him, in the cabin, lay a woman who trusted him with what she could no longer protect. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind already shifting, priorities rearranging themselves with ruthless clarity. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to Rex. "I see it." Rex turned forward again, ears up, and resumed the trail. The trail narrowed as it climbed, the trees thinning until they gave way to jagged rock and wind-scoured ground. Snow no longer lay evenly here. It clung in sharp drifts, peeled back in others to expose dark stone beneath, as if the mountain itself were shedding skin. Rex slowed as they approached the ridge, his gait changing first. No longer the steady pull of a dog following scent, but a hesitant, fractured movement, each step measured and uncertain. Ethan felt it too, though he could not have named it at first. The air carried something unfamiliar beneath the cold, a sharp, sterile tang that did not belong to pine or frozen earth. Metal, old oil, the faint chemical bitterness of something long sealed and poorly forgotten. The structure emerged gradually through the blowing snow, its outline breaking the natural geometry of the land. Low and angular, partially sunken into the rock face, the building looked less like a station and more like a scar. Its concrete walls were thick, reinforced, designed to endure both weather and secrecy. A rusted antenna leaned at an awkward angle from the roof, snapped and useless. Faded warning signs clung stubbornly to the entrance, their lettering eaten away by decades of exposure. Ethan stopped short. Rex did not. The dog took 2 steps forward, then froze. His body trembled visibly now, not from the cold. His ears flattened against his skull, his tail tucked lower than Ethan had ever seen it. A low sound tore from his chest, raw and unrestrained, echoing strangely against the concrete. Rex backed away, claws scraping against stone, eyes wide and unfocused, as if the building itself were alive and watching. "Hey," Ethan said sharply, dropping to one knee and gripping Rex's collar. "Rex, look at me." The dog's breathing was fast, shallow. His muscles twitched beneath his coat, caught between flight and something deeper, something wired into him long before this mountain had ever been quiet. Ethan followed Rex's gaze back to the structure, understanding settling in with sickening clarity. This place did not frighten Rex because it was unknown. It frightened him because it was familiar. The smell confirmed it. Beneath the metallic tang was something older and worse. Antiseptic chemicals layered over fear sweat, the ghost of kennels and restraints and procedures carried out without warmth or mercy. Ethan had seen places like this overseas, facilities where efficiency had replaced compassion, where animals were not partners, but instruments. He tightened his grip on Rex's collar until the tremors eased slightly. "You're with me," he said, low and steady. "You're here now." Rex swallowed hard, the sound audible even over the wind, and forced himself forward again, though his body resisted every step. The door to the station hung partially ajar, its hinges groaning softly as the wind shifted. Ethan moved first this time, positioning himself between Rex and the opening. Inside, the air was colder, but strangely still, as if the thick walls muffled the storm's violence. The light was dim, filtered through narrow, reinforced windows caked with ice. They found Lucas near the far wall. The boy knelt on the concrete floor, his small frame hunched protectively around a shape wrapped in his jacket. His gloves lay discarded nearby, fingers stiff with frost. His face was red and raw from cold, freckles standing out sharply against pale skin. Dark hair clung damply to his forehead, curls flattened by sweat and snow. He looked up when he heard them, eyes widening first with fear, then with something like relief that broke through despite his obvious effort to hold himself together. "Don't come closer," Lucas said, his voice hoarse but steady. He shifted instinctively, placing his body more firmly between Ethan and what he was protecting. Ethan raised his hands slowly, palms open. "Easy. I'm not here to take anything from you." Lucas studied him for a long moment, gaze flicking briefly to Rex, and then back again. Something in the way Rex stood, head lowered, ears back but eyes gentle, seemed to soften him. "He's hurt," Lucas said quietly. "I couldn't leave him." Ethan crouched a few feet away and saw the animal clearly for the first time. The German Shepherd was younger than Rex, maybe 3 or 4 years old, but starvation and injury had carved years into his frame. His coat was patchy, dulled from its natural sheen, ribs faintly visible beneath matted fur. One hind leg was swollen, held awkwardly off the ground, the result of either old trauma or something more deliberate. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, tracking every movement with wary intelligence. When Rex took a tentative step closer, the injured dog did not growl. He simply watched, breathing shallow but controlled. Lucas reached down and brushed snow from the dog's muzzle with bare fingers. The animal leaned into the touch despite himself, a quiet whine slipping free before he could stop it. "He followed me," Lucas said, as if explaining a simple fact. "Or maybe I followed him. I don't know." Before Ethan could respond, Rex stiffened again. Not in fear this time, but alertness. His head snapped toward the entrance, ears rising, body angling protectively in front of Lucas and the wounded dog. The sound came a second later, the crunch of boots on snow. Controlled, deliberate. Ethan's hand went instinctively to his rifle, heart rate climbing, senses sharpening. He positioned himself subtly between the boy and the doorway, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the threshold. 3 figures stepped inside. They were dressed for the cold, but not like hikers or rescue workers. Their movements were economical, practiced. Weapons were slung casually but ready, the kind of familiarity that came from repetition rather than theory. The man in front was tall and thin, his posture slightly stooped despite his height, as if years of leaning over tables had shaped him more than terrain ever could. His hair was iron gray, cut close to his scalp, his face long and sharp-featured, with a narrow mouth that suggested habitual dissatisfaction. Wire-frame glasses perched on his nose, lenses fogging briefly as he crossed the threshold. Dr. Henry Walsh. Ethan recognized the type instantly. Walsh was not built for violence, but he wore authority like armor. His eyes moved quickly, cataloging, assessing. They lingered on the injured dog with unmistakable interest. "Well," Walsh said, his voice calm, almost pleasant, "this is inconvenient." Lucas flinched at the sound. The wounded dog growled low, pain sharpening the note. Walsh glanced down at the boy, expression flickering briefly with irritation before smoothing again. "You shouldn't be here," he said, as though chastising a child for muddy boots. "You shouldn't either," Ethan replied coldly. Walsh turned his attention fully to Ethan then, gaze sharpening. Up close, the lines on his face told a story of long nights and longer resentments. He looked like a man who had been brilliant once and never forgiven the world for failing to recognize it. "This facility," Walsh said, gesturing vaguely around them, "was decommissioned years ago. What remains here is government property, sensitive property." Ethan did not answer. He watched the men flanking Walsh, broad-shouldered, bearded, eyes flat and uncurious. Enforcers, not thinkers. Walsh's gaze returned to the injured dog. "That animal," he continued, "is part of a discontinued research line. Early generation biological tracking. Crude by today's standards, but still valuable." Ethan felt a cold anger settle into his chest. "He's not a thing," Lucas said suddenly, his voice trembling but firm. "He's alive." Walsh smiled thinly. "Of course he is. That's what made him useful." Rex stepped forward then, placing himself fully between Walsh and the boy. His body was rigid, every line screaming restraint. His teeth showed, not in a snarl, but in warning. Walsh's smile faded. He adjusted his glasses, studying Rex with something like nostalgia. "I remember you," he murmured. "Or one like you." Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. Walsh straightened, decision made. "We'll take the animal," he said to his men. "The boy is irrelevant." Lucas's fingers dug into the wounded dog's fur, his shoulders squaring in a way that was heartbreakingly brave. Ethan stepped forward. "No," he said, the word landing with quiet finality. The air in the room shifted. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent. Inside, lines were drawn that could not be erased. Lucas had not just saved a dog, he had uncovered something that was never meant to be found. The first shot was never fired. It was the shift in the air that gave it away. The sudden tightening, the way sound seemed to flatten and narrow, as if the world were drawing a breath and holding it. Ethan felt it before he saw movement, the old instincts rising uninvited, unwelcome, but precise. He stepped laterally without thinking, dashing himself between Lucas and the men who had entered the station, his body angling to shield rather than confront. Rex mirrored the movement, muscles coiling, eyes locked on Walsh's flanking guards. Walsh's voice carried again, calm and clipped, the tone of a man who believed he owned outcomes. "Take the animal," he said, not raising it. "Carefully. The chip must remain intact." The two armed men moved. They were built for enforcement, thick through the shoulders, bearded, faces weathered by cold and indifference. One had a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the kind that never healed cleanly, pulling his expression into a permanent scowl. The other kept his jaw clenched, eyes flat, hands steady on his weapon. They did not look at Lucas. They did not need to. Ethan reacted. He drove forward, using the narrowness of the space to his advantage, slamming his shoulder into the nearest man before the weapon could come fully up. Pain exploded through his left side as cold stiffened muscles protested, a white-hot flash that radiated down his arm. He ignored it, pivoted, and forced the man back into a steel table bolted to the floor. The impact rang through the station, metal shrieking as old bolts strained. The second guard lunged. Ethan ducked under the swing, boots sliding on ice-slick concrete, and felt something wrench sharply in his shoulder as he twisted too far, too fast. His arm went numb almost instantly, fingers tingling uselessly. Cold. Impact. Bad angle. He grit his teeth and stayed upright. Rex surged forward then, not toward the men, but toward the injured German shepherd huddled against the wall. The smaller dog flinched, tried to rise, failed. Rex positioned himself over him, broad back forming a living barrier, teeth bared in a silent, ferocious warning. It was not strategy. It was instinct. The unthinking, absolute directive to protect one of his own. Walsh shouted something sharp and angry, frustration cracking his composed veneer. The station dissolved into chaos. A rifle discharged somewhere behind Ethan, the report deafening in the enclosed space. Concrete chips sprayed from the wall as the round ricocheted. Lucas cried out, a raw, frightened sound that cut through Ethan's focus like a blade. "Lucas!" Ethan shouted, turning. Too fast. A shape moved through the fog of breath and blowing snow that had been dragged inside with the storm. Small, hooded. For a fraction of a second, Ethan's training took over completely. His finger tightened on the trigger, sight aligning automatically. Then Rex barked. Once, sharp and urgent. Ethan froze. The shape stumbled forward into clearer light, and Ethan saw Lucas's face beneath the hood, eyes wide with terror, cheeks streaked red from cold and tears. Ethan lowered the rifle, heart slamming against his ribs hard enough to hurt. For one terrifying heartbeat, he had been a hair's breadth from killing a child. The realization hit him harder than any blow. His breath came ragged, chest tight. The world narrowing, not from danger, but from shame. This is not what you're here for. The thought cut through the fog with brutal clarity. The reflexes that had once saved lives were now a liability. The war inside him did not recognize context. It did not care about innocence. A howl split the air, not from a human. The injured German shepherd lunged weakly, snapping at the approaching guard who had circled wide, his movement fueled by desperation rather than strength. The man cursed and raised his weapon instinctively. Rex moved. He did not charge the man directly. He veered, fast and low, slamming into the guard's legs from the side with the full force of his weight. The man went down hard, weapons skittering across the floor. Rex did not follow through. He pivoted back immediately, placing himself once again over the smaller dog, body trembling now, breath coming in harsh pants. A sharp crack echoed through the station. Ethan felt it before he saw it. Rex's body jerking, his back legs buckling as a round grazed him low, tearing through muscle. Rex collapsed to the concrete with a heavy thud, a sound that carried far too much finality. "No!" Ethan shouted. Something broke loose inside him then. Not rage, not the cold precision of combat, but something older and more dangerous. He moved without thinking, using the environment rather than force. He kicked loose a rusted overhead light, plunging half the station into darkness. Snow blew in thick now, visibility dropping to arm's length. He grabbed Lucas by the collar and shoved him behind a reinforced pillar, his body shielding the boy as more shots rang out, wild and poorly aimed. "Stay down!" he barked. Walsh's voice rose above the noise, thin with fury. "Fall back! We're exposed!" Outside, a distant sound cut through the storm. Low at first, then growing, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades struggling against wind. A search helicopter. Rangers. The men hesitated. The shift immediate. Risk recalculated. Exposure unacceptable. They retreated fast, dragging the wounded guard between them, boots slipping on ice as they vanished into the white. Walsh lingered at the threshold for a fraction of a second, eyes locking with Ethan's. The scientist's expression held no remorse, only calculation and the promise of unfinished business. Then he was gone. The station fell silent except for the storm and the ragged sound of breathing. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Rex, hands shaking now that their ex was down. Blood darkened the fur along Rex's hindquarters, steaming faintly in the cold air. The dog's eyes were open, glassy but aware, chest heaving shallowly. "I've got you," Ethan said, his voice rough, stripped bare of everything but need. "Stay with me. Stay." Rex tried to lift his head, failed, and settled again, a low whine vibrating through his chest. Lucas crawled closer, fear momentarily forgotten. "Is he—" "He's alive," Ethan snapped, then softened his tone. "He's alive." He pressed his hands against the wound, applying pressure, mind racing through damage control. The shot hadn't been clean. Muscle damage, maybe bone. Severe blood loss compounded by cold. Rex's body was already shaking, the adrenaline bleeding out. Outside, the helicopter circled once more, then moved off, driven away by worsening weather. The Rangers would be delayed. Minutes stretched dangerously thin. Ethan looked at Rex, at the dog who had never questioned, never hesitated, never left his side, even when every instinct screamed to run. The war had followed him here after all, and this time, it had taken something from him. He leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against Rex's, breath fogging between them. "I'm here," he whispered. "You hear me? I'm not walking away." Rex's tail twitched once, faint but unmistakable. Then his body went still. They moved Rex back to the cabin in silence, the kind that pressed down on the ears and made every breath sound too loud. Ethan carried most of the weight, his injured shoulder screaming with every step, his boots slipping on packed snow as Lucas struggled to keep pace beside him. The wounded German shepherd was left behind in the station for now, hidden as best they could, the risk accepted without discussion. There were limits to what a body could carry through a storm, and Ethan had already crossed several. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen completely. The fire was still alive, stubborn embers glowing beneath ash, where Ethan had banked it earlier. Claire was awake when they came in, propped against the wall near the stove, her face drawn tight with pain and worry that sharpened the lines around her eyes. She took one look at Rex, blood-matted fur, hind legs dragging uselessly, and the professional part of her took over without hesitation. "Put him here," she said, pointing to the cleared space near the hearth. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled faintly as she pushed herself upright, favoring her injured leg. Claire Monroe had always been like this. tall and wiry, built more for endurance than softness. Her dark blonde hair pulled back now with a strip of torn cloth. Years of working with frightened animals had given her a calm that did not erase fear but moved through it. Tonight, that calm was the only thing holding the room together. Ethan laid Rex down gently, easing him onto a thick blanket. The dog did not resist. His breathing was shallow, uneven, eyes half-lidded but aware. When Ethan knelt beside him, Rex's tail gave a faint, involuntary twitch, as if recognizing presence even through the haze of pain. Claire dropped to her knees with a controlled hiss of discomfort, already assessing. "The bullet didn't shatter bone," she said after a moment, fingers probing carefully. "But it tore muscle. There's bleeding we can't ignore." Lucas hovered near the door, arms wrapped tightly around himself, his face pale beneath wind-burned cheeks. He looked smaller now, stripped of the resolve that had carried him into the storm. When Claire met his eyes, she softened just enough. "Lucas," she said gently, "I need you to be brave for a few minutes." He nodded immediately, too quickly. "I can do it." Ethan stepped back, suddenly unsure where to stand. He had faced men dying in his arms before, had made calls that no one else wanted to make. But this was different. There was no enemy here, no objective to complete. Just a dog he loved, and the knowledge that skill and strength might not be enough. Claire worked with what she had. A battered medical kit, clean cloth torn into strips, alcohol meant for sterilizing tools, not easing pain. She warned them quietly before she began, voice low and honest. "I don't have enough anesthetic," she said. "I can dull it, not erase it." Rex heard her voice and shifted weakly, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Ethan leaned forward without thinking, one hand settling firmly against Rex's shoulder, the other cupping his broad head. "I'm here," he murmured. "You're not alone." The surgery was crude and careful all at once. Claire's hands were steady despite the conditions, fingers moving with practiced precision as she cleaned the wound and worked to repair what she could. Rex cried out once, a sharp, broken sound that cut straight through Ethan's chest. His grip tightened reflexively, his forehead dropping against the dog's. It was in that moment, when Rex's body went rigid beneath his hands, when there was nothing Ethan could do but hold on, that the truth landed fully. This was helplessness. Not the tactical kind, not the controlled chaos of combat where even failure had structure. This was standing witness to pain you could not stop, trusting someone else to carry the burden. Ethan's breath came uneven. He focused on Rex's heartbeat beneath his palm, counting it, grounding himself the way he had once been taught to do with men on the edge of panic. Only now, the technique was turned inward. Time stretched strangely. The storm outside rose and fell, wind howling, then fading to a whisper before surging again. At some point, Lucas began to cry quietly, shoulders shaking, tears dripping soundlessly onto the floor. No one told him to stop. Halfway through the procedure, Rex's eyes rolled back briefly, his breathing faltering. Claire froze, her face draining of color. "Ethan," she said sharply. He leaned closer, speaking into Rex's ear, his voice rough and urgent. "Hey, stay with me. You hear me? You don't get to quit." For a heartbeat that felt endless, there was nothing. Then, Rex sucked in a shallow, rasping breath and exhaled slowly. His body sagged, tension releasing just enough to allow Claire to continue. Ethan felt something shift inside him then. Not relief, not yet, but a fragile, dangerous hope. The kind that hurt if you held it too tightly. When it was over, Claire slumped back against the wall, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline. Her hands were streaked with blood, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. She closed her eyes briefly, then looked at Rex, chest rising and falling in a slow, uneven rhythm. "He'll live," she said quietly. "But he won't be the same." Ethan nodded. He had known that before she said it. "He doesn't need to be." Claire studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing through her gaze. Then she looked away, reaching for a blanket to cover Rex more fully. Lucas approached hesitantly, dropping to his knees beside the dog. He reached out, stopped himself, then gently laid his hand against Rex's side, careful not to touch the wound. Rex's ear flicked faintly. "I'm sorry," Lucas whispered, voice thick. "This is my fault." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No," Lucas flinched, surprised by the firmness of it. "You did what you thought was right," Ethan said, softer now. "That matters." Lucas swallowed hard, eyes shining. "I didn't want to be someone who walks away." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Without thinking, without planning, the words slipped out of him, small, fragile, carrying more weight than it should have. "Dad?" The sound of it echoed in the cabin like something dropped and not yet broken. Lucas's eyes widened in horror. I didn't mean... I'm sorry. I shouldn't..." Ethan did not correct him. He did not smile or speak or reach out. He simply stayed where he was, one hand resting on Rex, the other braced against the floor, breathing slowly as the words settled into place. Claire watched him closely, her expression softening into something like understanding. She said nothing. Rex shifted slightly, tail moving once, a faint, almost imperceptible motion, as if acknowledging the new configuration of the pack. Outside, the storm continued its endless argument with the mountain. Inside, something quieter and more enduring took shape. This family had not been forged by blood or law or shared history. It had been assembled from broken pieces, people and animals who had, at one point or another, chosen not to turn away. And that choice, Ethan realized, was the one thing no military training had ever prepared him for. Spring came late to the mountains, as if the land itself needed time to decide whether it was ready to forgive winter. The snow did not vanish all at once. It retreated in thin, uneven lines along the tree roots and rock faces, leaving behind dark, wet earth that smelled of iron and thaw. The cabin stood exactly where it always had, but the world around it softened, edges rounding, silence changing its tone. Ethan watched the melt from the porch most mornings, a mug of coffee warming his hands, while Rex lay nearby, stretched out in the weak sun. The dog moved differently now. His back leg carried a slight hitch, more noticeable when he stood from rest, but it did not slow him the way Ethan had once feared. Rex adapted, as working dogs always did. He chose his footing more carefully, rested when his body asked for it, and still kept his gaze moving, always aware. Rex would never return to combat work. That was clear. But he had not become fragile. If anything, his presence carried more weight now, quieter and deeper. Visitors noticed it immediately, the way he positioned himself near children without crowding them, the way his eyes softened around injured animals, the way he never barked unless something truly demanded attention. Claire noticed it too, though she rarely said so aloud. The rehabilitation station had grown slowly, almost accidentally. What began as a few reinforced kennels and a converted shed had become a place people sought out deliberately. Injured wildlife brought in by rangers, search and rescue dogs with torn ligaments or shaken confidence, animals that had been useful once and then discarded when usefulness faded. Claire ran the operation with steady authority. She moved on crutches at first, then with a brace, her limp lessening as the weeks passed. She cut her hair shorter after the storm, dark blonde strands now brushing just above her shoulders, practical and unadorned. The work suited her. It always had. Her patience with animals was matched only by her intolerance for cruelty, and word of that spread faster than any advertisement. Ethan handled the physical side of things, repairs, training grounds, teaching handlers how to work with animals rather than over them. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. His calm carried farther than shouting ever could. People asked him sometimes if he missed the teams, the structure, the clarity of missions with defined ends. He gave them polite answers. He did not tell them about the nights he still woke up before dawn, heart racing, listening for threats that no longer came. He did not tell them about the ease with which violence still lived in his muscles, waiting for permission. He had chosen not to go back. The decision had not been dramatic. No final conversation, no declaration. Just a quiet understanding that returning would mean becoming something he no longer wanted to be. Lucas grew into the space in ways that surprised them all. At 12, he was all elbows and restless energy, his grief still close to the surface but no longer consuming him. Ethan taught him survival skills the way they should be taught, not as preparation for conflict, but as lessons in responsibility. How to read weather without instruments. How to build a shelter that respected the land instead of fighting it. How to recognize when helping meant staying and when it meant letting go. Lucas learned quickly. He asked difficult questions. Sometimes he went quiet for long stretches, staring out at the trees as if listening for something only he could hear. When that happened, Rex often lay down beside him, close enough to touch. A warm and steady presence that required no explanation. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that the rehook came, not with drama, but with stillness. A transport truck arrived unannounced, tires crunching over the last patches of snow. Two men stepped out, dressed in federal green, their posture careful, their expressions neutral. One was younger, clean-shaven, eyes sharp and alert. The other was older, broad-shouldered, his beard shot through with gray, his movements slower but deliberate. They introduced themselves as representatives from a federal oversight office. They did not say Walsh's name at first. Ethan listened without interruption as they explained what had followed the storm. Sealed indictments, recovered data, facilities quietly dismantled. The past being buried properly at last. Then the older man glanced toward Rex, who lay watching from the shade. "That dog," he said carefully, "was listed as destroyed." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. He wasn't. The man nodded once, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. It seems some things survived despite the paperwork. They left without further incident, their presence lingering like a shadow even after the truck disappeared down the trail. Lucas watched them go, his face thoughtful. "They're done, aren't they?" he asked. Ethan considered the question. "They're quieter," he said. "That's not the same thing, but it's closer than it was." Life continued. Rex became the station's symbol without anyone deciding it should be so. His image appeared on a simple wooden sign at the trailhead, carved by a local artisan who had watched him work with injured dogs and decided some things deserved to be remembered. Visitors often mistook him for a hero, expecting stories of daring rescues and fearless charges. Ethan never corrected them directly. He simply said, "He listens." And that was enough. On a clear morning toward the end of April, Ethan stood on the porch again, watching the last stubborn patches of snow surrender to the sun. Claire was inside, speaking softly to a volunteer. Lucas was down by the training field, practicing knots with deliberate care. Rex lay at Ethan's feet, head resting on one paw, eyes half closed but alert. Ethan thought of the man he had been when he first came to the mountains. Angry, precise, running from silence because it reminded him too much of everything he had done. He thought of the storm, of blood on snow, of a child's voice cutting through fog. He was not cured. He was not healed in the way stories liked to promise. But he was no longer hiding. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of thawing earth and pine. Ethan breathed it in slowly. For the first time in a long while, destiny did not need to shout. He had learned to listen. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire. Sometimes they come quietly, on four wounded legs, in the middle of a storm, when someone chooses not to walk away. This story is not only about a man, or a dog, or a winter that nearly took everything. It is about the moments in our own lives when we hear a small voice calling for help, and we must decide whether we will listen. Many of us pray for signs, for clarity, for God to speak loudly. But often, His guidance comes through compassion, through instinct, through the simple courage to stay, when leaving would be easier. If you are watching this and carrying your own battles, know this: you are not forgotten. Even in the coldest season, even when silence feels overwhelming, there is purpose moving quietly around you. Sometimes God does not remove the storm. Sometimes He sends a companion into it with you. May God watch over you, protect you, and give you the strength to choose mercy over fear, presence over escape, and love over indifference. May He place the right people and even the right animals in your path when you need them most. And may you become that quiet miracle for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. And consider subscribing to Silent Paws Steady Hearts so we can continue sharing stories of loyalty, resilience, and the quiet bonds that save lives. May God bless you and keep you. May you never walk alone,